I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is brought to you by the Edmund Burke Foundation. And today we're going to talk about 4 vital topics. Among them, Paul Ryan challenging the idea of conservatives focusing on the culture. We're also going to talk about Governor Ron DeSantis's protection of girls in sports and beyond in Florida schools. We will talk to Josh about his recent trip to Eastern Europe and some of the lessons and insights with respect to national conservatism writ large. And then I'll talk a little bit about trolling from the Russian government and the greater issues in terms of US-Russian relations that we're dealing with today. So with that, I will kick it over to Rachel.
So Paul Ryan is back on the scene. You may remember him from such stints as Speaker of the House several years ago. He's back, people. And he recently made a speech kind of wrapping his mind around the Trump era, because all of us at the end of the Trump era were just dying to hear what Paul Ryan thought about it. And he was really gracious enough to share his insights. And 2 things really struck me about the speech. One was that he was sort of very directly calling out, Donald Trump and the people around him, but didn't really name any names. And I just thought, if you're going to make a speech like that, man, you gotta bring the heat. You actually have to say who you're talking about. But the second thing that I think is even more important, and kind of what I want to talk about now, is Paul Ryan's take on the culture war. And this was a big distinction for the Trump era because, and I've written essays about this before, but I think what really demarcated Trump from a lot of his predecessors was his willingness to just wade into it and take on challenges that people, heretofore presidents were just not willing, passed down which they were not willing to go. And you saw this on pro-life issues, you saw this on transgender issues, you saw this on, critical race theory across the government, things that make people uncomfortable at a dinner party in elite circles. Donald Trump was sort of willing to just say, hell no. And the way in which Paul Ryan framed this for the future of the Republican Party, I think, is very instructive about sort of the current divide within the institutional party itself. And I want to read his quote. It's a little bit lengthy, but I think it's important. So I'm going to read it. He says, quote, "But as the left gets more woke, the rest of America is getting weary. This stuff is exhausting. And we conservatives had got to be careful not to get caught up in every little cultural battle. Sometimes these skirmishes are just creations of outraged peddlers, detached from reality and not worth anybody's time. They draw attention away from the far more important case we must make to the American people. Culture matters. Yes, but our party must be defined by more than a tussle over the latest grievance or perceived slight. We must not let them take priority over solutions grounded in principle to improve people's lives, because politics based on racial or other identity is always a path to deeper and deeper hostility with sad and harmful consequences, and it is precisely the opposite of conservative thought." End quote. Now, I agree with him in some respects, right? Politics centered around race, identity, gender, all these things is harmful. But in the same paragraph, in the same statement where he's saying, it's absolutely contrary to conservative thought, in the same breath, he's saying, but it's too big of an issue for us to focus on. It's not conservative to go after grievance culture, to go after perceived slights. And I just find this so, again, indicative of this green eye shade view in the Republican Party that I think exists among certain members, which say, look, conservatism is really just about the market. It's about free markets. It's about free minds. And this is ensconced in our principles. And that in itself is not wrong, right? Like, nobody disagrees with that, but it's such a narrowed view that I think it really misses to a great extent what people really have on their minds in the Republican Party. The culture issues, I think, even in more ways than the market itself, because I think so much of our market conversation gets taken up by the issues of high finance, and what's going on Wall Street, where half of America isn't even invested, but culture is every single day. And when you have issues like critical race theory, when you have, key cultural moments, that impacts people day to day. And I would hypothesize anyway, that Donald Trump's sort of relentless focus on those things actually brought people into the party. It didn't push them away. So I think Paul Ryan's thesis here is wrong, but I think it's very indicative of the war we're still waging in the Republican Party. And I would also add this example, which David French and Chris Rufo, in a recent podcast that was sent out through Barry Weiss's Substack, debated this issue of critical race theory. And I again see the sort of Paul Ryan-esque framing from someone like David French, who basically, in this whole conclusion, in which, his whole conclusion after Chris Rufo gives a very incisive take about how critical race theory is taking over the major institutions of government, the major institutions of culture and thought in our public schools. And it's not merely teaching about race theory. It's saying, no, it's a mandated, participatory, compelled speech issue. David French's conclusion that's not the real problem in America. The real problem in America is the illiberal right and January 6th, and Donald Trump. And again, I just see this as people unable to, and not to defame them personally, right? I think they're all genuinely well-meaning people, but it's an inability, I think, to grasp the larger issue at stake, which is culture and the free market transact upon each other in really meaningful ways. And right now, this is the issue of our time. And I guess I would just throw it open to the group, because I think this is the battle a little bit for the soul of the Republican Party. If we are to be a party that sustains electorally and has an agenda of any substance and meaning to what people are actually dealing with, we have to get our heads right about this question.
I agree. I think it's a very outdated mindset to assume that, or not even to assume, but to think and suggest that some of these cultural battles aren't as important as they actually are to regular people. The way Paul Ryan's framing is that, like, listen, this doesn't affect the average voter. It's actually, that's the way Kamala Harris used to talk. She said she had this 3 a.m. policy that when people go to sleep at night, what's on their mind is not identity politics. And I think that's correct, in the same way that Rachel said, Paul Ryan isn't entirely wrong. But when people's head hit the pillow at night and they lie awake wondering what's going to happen to their family, it's not just about that insurance bill. It's not just about their medical bills. It's not just about putting food on the table. Now it's actually, how do they put food on the table when there's this ambient threat of cancellation if they happen to be Trump supporters in the wrong neighborhood, or an ambient threat of cancellation because their kid says something silly, or not being able to raise their kids the way that they want to and still send them to the public schools that our taxpayer dollars promote. So it's a very outdated mindset to see these as two different things. I mean, listen, Paul Ryan is somebody who would probably think, and by the way, I agree, I think he is a well-intentioned person, and I've long admired him, although that has dwindled in recent years. But when I look at what happened on Blue's Clues this week, and I'll keep it brief, I don't know if you guys saw this, but they had a pride parade on Blue's Clues that was, the kind of things that would give cultural conservatives nightmares, make them shudder in their sleep. It was very, very sexual. It was a very sexualized pride parade that was on Blue's Clues. Paul Ryan probably doesn't think we should be talking about that. Based on his comments, it sounds like he thinks that's one of those battles that's just silly to fight. That's something that's like getting in the mud and in the nitty gritty of the culture war, and we don't have any business actually really talking about it. But that's so important. And I'll toss to the group after that. I mean, that's what our children are learning, and it's a battle that's worth fighting. I mean, that's a network. That's a corporate network with millions of people. I don't know. I think it's a battle that's worth fighting.
Yeah, the year is 2021, and apparently Paul Ryan is still reading his crib notes from the Republican National Committee's autopsy of the 2012 loss to Barack Obama. I mean, we've so kind of been there, done that. This has been kind of systematically disproven, debunked, use whatever kind of fancy verb you want to use. I mean, just kind of like make sure all the listeners and viewers are on the same page after the Romney-Ryan defeat to Barack Obama and Joe Biden in 2012. The RNC puts out this so-called autopsy, trying to kind of discover what went wrong. And it was kind of your standard kind of consulting class, your standard kind of K Street Republicanism, your Wall Street Journal editorial board, right? I mean, like the people just want tax cuts, they want deregulation, and like, on social issues, don't touch that. The immigration stuff, like LGBT, whatever, like it's a little toxic. Don't go there. Obviously, like the fact that an outsider to the movement, an outsider to conservatism like Donald Trump beat, every kind of more traditionally quote unquote conservative candidate in 2016 proves something closely approximating is actually happening here, right? And political scientist Lee Drutman had this kind of XY scatter plot after the 2016 election, where the two axes on the 4-quadrant scatter plot, it's kind of like social conservatism, social liberalism, economic conservatism, economic liberalism. The thrust of the American voter, like the median voter, if you kind of look at this little scatter plot, is economically fairly centrist. By no means are they socialist, but by no means are they kind of like laissez-faire fundamentalists, and right of center on like bread and butter cultural issues. Like the median American, based on all the polling that we've actually seen on this, has a sense of appreciation for the American nation, for our customs, traditions, for our way of life. The median American voter does not want open borders. The median American does not want, biological men to compete in women's sports. It's a bit of a preview for our next segment. So all this is just completely wrong. And, it's kind of a parallel, right, to kind of this, quote unquote, zombie Reaganism, or really kind of just a bastardization of Reaganism that we hear from so many in kind of the more right liberal, classical liberal camp. We hear this over and over again, right? The only threat to our lives is the government with a gun. Rachel talked about this at great length in her fabulous recent antitrust essay for the American Conservative. It just totally misses the point. Like, you cannot possibly miss the point greater than this kind of outmoded paradigm. The real threat increasingly in our lives, the 21st century, is kind of the woke cultural hegemony of the ruling class. And the ruling class uses quote unquote private adjuncts like big tech, like big media, et cetera, as its kind of tools to subjugate those with whom it does not agree. So totally missing the forest for the trees here is Paul Ryan. Would kind of encourage him to go back to bow hunting, which I know is a favorite hobby of his.
All right, well, I'll try to be brief here and add some additional insight if I can to the already very solid comments. Just to say that, first of all, free markets and free minds. We have neither free markets nor free minds today. Free minds underpin a free enterprise system. And if you're not engaged in the culture war, you're not defending free minds. Also, the broader context, and we always go back to this, of what are the stakes of the situation, and that determines how you respond to it. As Josh just laid out eloquently, we're in a culture war. The other side has been engaged in a perpetual culture war for years. And because we haven't done that hard work that former Speaker Ryan spoke to, I think illustrates the fact that, again, the establishment does not realize the stakes writ large, and they continue essentially to want Trump and Trumpism to go away when it's broadly popular among rank and file Republicans, among voters in this country. And last but not least, cultural issues always inspire voters to an infinitely greater degree than most of the things that traditional Republicans want to talk about. Tax rates versus drag queen story hour funded by you, or your kids learning racial Marxism known as critical race theory. What is going to compel people more in their own lives to get out and get active and actually do something about the left's attempt to dominate and monopolize every single institution in this country? So it misses the forest for the trees and misses the stakes of the situation. But I think that these sorts of views are going to be rendered largely irrelevant in the midterm elections and then in 2024 as well, because I think the public is in a completely different position from their purported representatives.
Well, on that note, I think Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida is reading these tea leaves very well. And it's about so much more than just reading the tea leaves. This is about more than public opinion. This is about what's right. Ron DeSantis this week signed a bill into law that would protect girls and women's sports. I think it's actually, and Josh can get into this more as well from a legal perspective, I think it's actually a really tight bill, a really targeted bill. I think it was done responsibly. And I think it's a great piece of legislation that, by the way, is something people on both sides of the aisle, out of the context of these incredibly charged political conversations, would agree with. I think it's a populist piece of legislation, even if people in Washington don't understand that, as they so often fail to. And I think it's a great example of how Republican politicians can actually proactively protect our culture and reap political rewards at the same time, because there is this swath of the country that is pretty big, that is so exhausted with the bulldozing from the left and is so exhausted by being told from the left and from the establishment that they need to accept things like boys playing in women's sports and playing track. And if they don't, it's going to be a huge issue. There's going to be charges of bigotry. It's going to be very dramatic. People just want somebody to step in and put forward common sense legislation that takes some of these battles out of the arena, where we can just find that we agree on it. And so that the left can just read those tea leaves on their own and stop pushing. I mean, I literally saw the Associated Press's write-up of this say that DeSantis plunged Florida into a culture war. Ron DeSantis plunged Florida into the culture war, according to the Associated Press, by signing this piece of legislation. How backwards and insane is that? It's the left that plunged Florida into a culture war by attempting to change our sort of consensus about what constitutes a man and what constitutes a woman. The change that progressives are openly seeking to cause, that's what's plunging Florida into a culture war. So to pin this on Ron DeSantis is insane, but the media's framing of this goes to how disconnected they are from public opinion and why it's actually pretty smart for Ron DeSantis to come in and do the right thing. So on two levels, this is how I'll throw it to the group. On two levels, it's the right policy. It's a bill that other Republican governors should be pursuing, unless I'm missing something. I'm not a lawyer. So it's a good piece of legislation. It's a good bill. It should be a model for other states. And on the other hand, it's politically expedient because there's an appetite for this kind of people always like to talk about common sense conservatism, and it's usually in a fiscal sense, right? Like, we're going to balance our checkbook. Common sense conservatism is, this bill is a case study in that, if ever there were one. So on that point, I'll open it up to the group here.
Well, I think this is sort of the hilarious thing to me about the corporate press, right? It's like the shark is biting your leg and they write a headline like "Man tempted shark." It's just like the shark already has a hold of you, people. Like I don't understand how this is an actual serious conversation. But I also think, Emily, the point you made is correct when it comes to the left. It's like, this is the sort of progressive virtue signaling that always distills into NIMBYism. And this is why I think this is going to be so much more popular than people are giving the DeSantis bill credit for, because if you actually push a progressive on this issue, right, they'll be like, oh yeah, trans athletes should be able to compete. Like, aren't you for equality? Don't you love everyone? But then if it's their kid having to, that's a female kid having to compete against a man for like a track scholarship, you better believe they pull the kid out of school and put him somewhere else. This is how it always works. And so it was interesting. I saw the interview that Governor DeSantis did with Tucker Carlson last night, and I thought it was instructive because Tucker flat out asked him, like, did you get corporate pressure? Because we've seen this any number of cases now, most infamously the Kristi Noem case in South Dakota, where she met charges of having bent to the corporate power on this issue. And DeSantis was like, no, I didn't, because we made very clear we weren't going to entertain it. And so in so many ways, I think DeSantis has been a model for how you engage this moment culturally and politically. And, well done again on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, what is there to say about Ron DeSantis that has not already been said, right? I mean, he's just killing it. I mean, as far as I can tell, he has made Florida kind of like the iconic place to look to for what a red state should be doing. And by the way, as kind of an ex-Texan, like a Texan in exile who still has like vestigial loyalty to the Lone Star State to some extent, it's kind of interesting to see that Florida has almost like surpassed Texas as kind of like the most iconic red state in the country, frankly. And, it's worth emphasizing, like, this is happening in Florida. I mean, this is not happening in like Oklahoma or Wyoming. This is happening, in one of the most populous states in the country, like a major state. Two, it's an incredibly diverse state, obviously. I mean, in like any number of ways, racially, ethnically, religiously. This is not kind of like a more like homogenous state like a Wyoming or Montana or anything like that. So this is like a really big deal. I mean, obviously we all remember how DeSantis kind of navigating COVID in such an adroit manner, critical race theory, and now this. I mean, he's really kind of like the man for the moment, it increasingly seems. Obviously I'm sure he's eyeballing the 2024 presidential run. We'll see how that unfolds when he gets a little closer, but he's certainly positioning himself extraordinarily well, it seems. Look, on this issue in particular, though, Florida, again, no state income tax. I mean, this is a state where if there's going to be kind of like a woke capital threat, I mean, a lot of businesses have like increasingly been fleeing to Florida. They've been fleeing to Tennessee. They've been fleeing to Texas. They've been fleeing to a lot of these kind of no state income tax Republican governed states. So if Ron DeSantis can kind of like stand athwart woke capital yelling stop, so to speak, on an issue that cuts to the very core of the liberal imperium, and that is this issue, and to literally sign it, I mean, whether it's intentional or not, to sign this thing, on the first day of so-called Pride Month. I mean, man, I mean, like in Yiddish, we would call that chutzpah, right? I mean, but that is like, that takes, I'll just say it, that takes some balls. I mean, this, he is out there, he is fearless. But, to get to kind of like connect the previous segment to this one, I mean, he understands, I think, that you can withstand some blowback initially for something like this, because the median American voter understands that this is common sense. As Abigail Shrier has said over and over and over again, no matter how much chemical castration, no matter how much hormonal injection, no matter how much of all that a teenager, a young adult, whatever, goes through, there are certain things like muscle mass, bone density that will simply never be equal. Okay, so look, I don't know what else to say, honestly. I mean, good for Ron DeSantis. People like Kristi Noem, Asa Hutchinson, a lot of these people increasingly just look terrible when someone from effectively a swing state, an increasingly right-leaning swing state, but when a major governor of a major right-leaning swing state is kind of outgunning you, I think a lot of these kind of smaller state, red state governors ought to look in the mirror and ask what they're doing in response.
I'd make a couple points. First of all, the idea that standing up for the laws of nature constitutes a courageous act today, I think tells you everything about where the commanding heights of our society are. Again, I'd make a distinction between where the people in this country are versus where the people who have the tallest soapboxes and the loudest megaphones are in this country. And I continue to think that there's a huge chasm between the two, mercifully so. With respect to Florida, although I think there ought to be a sort of Make America Florida movement in this country, I do fear that the governor might be a victim of his success, not in the near term, but at least for the state more broadly, because you have all of these expats from places like where I am, New Jersey and New York, et cetera, all moving down there. And as Josh mentioned, any number of large corporations also moving there. So I do fear for Florida's future, and that's sort of a perverse, detrimental aspect of all the successes that the governor's had and the benefits that have redounded to the state as well. As for the notion that the hackish title for that article about plunging Florida into a culture war, again, I refer back to my earlier comment. In some ways, it is right, because one side has been engaged in a culture war. The other side has been nowhere to be found for decades. So it really hasn't been a war until now. And thank God there are some governors in this country who are engaging in it. And last but not least, one other positive effect of every single battle that Governor DeSantis has taken is that hopefully this encourages other governors and politicians at all levels, really, of taking on these fights as well, if for no other reason than out of their own political self-interest, that they see that this is popular and there actually is a base for it. And so let's hope that Governor DeSantis, in effect, makes Republicans a lot more conservative than they are today.
This is just a great conversation, guys. And I think we're all sort of coming from a similar position on it, but at the same time, it's important. I think it's important to remind established Republicans how out of touch their advisors often are, and listen to some real common sense. So on that note, I will kick it over to our next topic.
Yeah, so I mean, from cultural conservatism, otherwise known as kind of common sense conservatism in the Sunshine State, to common sense conservatism behind the old Iron Curtain, I suppose. So I recently got back to the U.S. from Poland, my first time there. I guess in Europe, I'd previously been, I guess the furthest east I was like Munich or Vienna, but I'd never been actually behind the old proper Iron Curtain itself. I was there for a conference, well, I guess a couple of conferences, but I spoke at a think tank was launching a new university, Collegium Intermarium on Friday. There were some other Americans there, Rod Dreher, Gladden Papin, a few others as well. But I kind of more generally just used this time to kind of just explore what all the so-called fuss is about in the region. I was really honored and privileged to get a kind of an extensive one-on-one sit-down interview with Prime Minister Morawiecki of Poland. That'll be out soon at Newsweek. I'm excited to share that with you. But I think a lot of people in the conservative movement, if you're kind of very online, as I say, if you follow the grumblings on Twitter at all, if you kind of follow what's going on in the present discourse, you've probably heard or seen some people talking about what is actually going on in some of these countries here. And the name of the new university that I mentioned, Collegium Intermarium, refers to the so-called Intermarium region, otherwise known as the Three Seas region. You have it's kind of the countries that are between the Adriatic Sea in the south, the Black Sea in the east, and the Baltic Sea in the north. And it's kind of the four Visegrad countries of Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, that kind of the core of that. So look, I mean, a lot of our kind of conservative friends on Twitter, you've probably seen them talking about Hungary. Prime Minister Viktor Orban has kind of, we gave Hungary, I think, multiple shout outs on the last podcast, actually. So just like remind the listeners, this is like a very conservative government there. It is strongly nationalist. They are strongly defensive of their customs, traditions, principles. I met a lot of Hungarians at this conference here. I met people kind of at the think tanks that are most closely affiliated with the current government on all the family policy stuff. And it's from what I can tell, it's the real deal here. And I'm excited to kind of bring to everyone the interview that we did of Prime Minister Morawiecki in Poland. But basically, just to kind of make it a little more abstract, and then we'll kind of get into the specifics here. What is actually going on in this region of Europe is you have to kind of look at the history here. Western Europe, France, Belgium, Netherlands, certainly Germany, of course. It's kind of like the hub of pro-EU sentiment. It is kind of the hub of Europhilia. And a lot of these countries, if I can just extrapolate for a moment, they kind of historically kind of have these instincts towards empires in general. The history of Germany with, foreign exporting, chauvinistic empirical sentiment needs no further explanation. Obviously, in France, you have kind of the whole Napoleonic era. So it just seems like there's something going on there historically that kind of leads them to kind of this kind of universalist empire mindset. And then, of course, the European Union is nothing if not a modern empire. But behind the old Iron Curtain, countries like Poland and Hungary, Czech Republic, former Czech President Václav Klaus actually gave a rousing address at this think tank launch event that I was at. These countries have been under the thumb of multiple forms of tyranny just over the past century, let alone going back beyond that. Obviously, is World War II and the Third Reich and the Nazis. And then, of course, immediately after that, you have, you of course have the Soviet Union and Stalin. So whether it was Nazi fascism or Soviet communism, a lot of these countries have just had their kind of national sentiments. They have been attempted to be eviscerated by numerous types of empires. So the current governments, they're very traditionalist. They are strong supporters of national borders. They are skeptical of the European Union. They have taken a very different approach to kind of the migrant crisis of Islamic immigration, of course, than a lot of these Western countries where you're seeing all these horrific attacks in France and Belgium, Germany, of course. They are skeptical to a large extent of both Putin's predations in Russia. That'll be our next segment. And they're also skeptical of a lot of what Angela Merkel is doing with her kind of pro-Brussels EU sentiment. So the kind of upshot of all this, and this is kind of where I'll kick it to the panel here. I think a lot of some people, a lot of perhaps kind of more, I guess, classical liberal, a lot of kind of more right liberal, more kind of, libertarian leaning conservatives basically see what's happening here and they say, oh, like, this is just a totally foreign tradition, right? We've kind of heard over and over again, European conservatism is not American conservatism. And, in a bygone era, years and years ago, I probably would have believed that, honestly. I probably would have told you that that these traditions are just so alien to one another that really is kind of no cross-cultural pollination. There's nothing here to actually be learned. I've come to basically flip on that over the past 5 years or so. And especially now that I've kind of been there and seen it for myself, there is kind of a certain kind of civic national pride that I think I saw on the ground. I spoke to the Poles, the Hungarians. I spoke to the youngest member of Ukrainian parliament elected in the history of the modern post-Berlin Wall falling Ukrainian parliament. These people they're very proud of their countries. They're very proud of their unique cultures. And it just seems to me that in a time where obviously, America it seems like it's kind of falling down the cracks and we have all these kind of racial, ethnic, regional, sexual, whatever kind of divisiveness and crass strife, that there is something to be learned from a very neglected part of the European continent. So kind of just happy to kick it over for any thoughts, reactions. Maybe I'm just off on this. Maybe European conservatism is actually too different than American conservatism, but it seems to me that there's at least something to be learned here.
I do wonder, so much of what's been written about conservatism and sort of the philosophical moorings of it does make it place specific, right? Like Kirk talks about this, Scruton talks about this, that conservatism is really rooted in its sense of place. So I do think that, copying one model exclusively is not going to yield the same results because the nature of community is so different. But that said, I do think it's been instructive to watch how they have sort of come out of this totalitarianism with an inherently conservative worldview that we have lacked, right? And that's always been one of the gripes about America from Europeans, right? That we have no idea what it's like to actually suffer, to actually go through, the real sort of uprisings and the suffering of modern civilization. And, I would argue that we're dealing with that a little bit, right? This sort of grip of relativism, moral relativism, all this kind of stuff that leads us into a cultural stagnation that, I do think that unchecked can give rise to, I think, really difficult politics. And I hope that we don't have to go through that. But I do think that we can look to these countries for instance, we talk a lot, I think that the last episode or the one before about Hungary's family policy, right? Things like this, which have actually had tangible outcomes that we are seeking similar results, right? We want to raise our birth rate. We have a crisis of natalism, all these things they've actually addressed with some meaningful success. So I personally always get a little cautious when I say one model that works somewhere is going to work somewhere else. Like we saw this with Iraq, right? Most famously, I think there's hubris in that. But I do think that it is instructive to look at these societies in particular and say, look, they are facing similar crises and this is how they've done it. I think we would do well to, I think, appreciate what they've done in that regard.
Yeah, let me just say to your point, Rachel, that it's a truism, but I don't think that it is internalized enough when it comes to policy, that different peoples are different. However, that being said, you have a model in parts of Eastern Europe and beyond of what happens after the Cultural Revolution runs its course. And the Cultural Revolution ultimately leads to actually heads rolling and true tyranny and gulags and oppression, the likes of which mercifully none of us in our lives have witnessed here, and hopefully our children and grandchildren never witness anything like that here. But I do think it always pays to look at those who have lived under tyranny to see what the responses are, and also to see where they turn to the extent there is actually recovery from it. And if you look at modern Russia or China still laboring under the Communist Party, in many respects, these nations and the peoples under them have never recovered from it. And there's still plenty of Eastern European countries who are languishing in many ways. But it's instructive to note that the communists always have to destroy any competing idea systems. Any dissent cannot be tolerated. You see, sort of the American model of it, sort of with Chinese characteristics, I guess, today on our streets, but especially sort of the Judeo-Christian root of much of Europe and beyond is something that the communists had to blot out. It's the greatest threat to godless, atheist communism, a materialist ideology versus spiritual or idealist ideology. And I think the fact that these nations have reverted to the foundational core principles on which our civilization is based is very instructive. And I can only hope that there's a similar pendulum swing here. I fear that things may have to get far worse for there to be that sort of rebirth and a refounding of our core values and principles. But we ought to look to Eastern Europe, at least as a model for perhaps what happens when we recover or attempt to recover after the anti-cultural revolution here rolls through.
Yeah, and this is not my area of expertise, but it has been really interesting to watch sort of in the Trump era and this populist moment, really since Brexit, which was right around the time that Donald Trump came on the scene. What I think is so fascinating and in a way heartening and in a way depressing about all of this is that I think it's a response to the theft of our humanity that we have sort of slowly been conditioned to accept and are now slowly realizing is not sustainable. So I think a lot of this is a response to alienation that is induced by technology. I think that's why we're seeing this happen across the developed Western world, because technology it's alienating us, it's dividing us. We are, to put it bluntly, fatter, we're unhealthier, we are in rough shape, and not just on our politics. We're addicted to pornography. I mean, all of these things, you go down the line and they add up to a completely different human experience. And so when we think about why, in Hungary, for instance, as we discussed last week, there may be this incredible appetite for classical architecture instead of postmodern nonsense. Why would that be? I mean, I think that springs from something that is anti-materialist. It doesn't know that it's anti-materialist, but fundamentally it is. It's the embodiment of us striving for something that is anti-materialist. We're striving for the sort of physical embodiment of what is good and true and beautiful because we're lacking it, but we don't know we're lacking it because we're so unmoored and godless and secular. And so I think that's why you're seeing some similar patterns, birth rates declining, but then, movements to address the declining birth rates in similar ways. I think that's why we're seeing these parallels in the United States and Europe, because fundamentally we're all humans and we're all undergoing this exact same, very trying human experience that has upended the human experience in a way I don't think anything else in the course of human civilization really has.
Yeah, and just to super quickly wrap a bow on this, and then I'll kick it over to Ben for the final segment here. I'm really happy that Emily mentioned kind of godlessness, because that really is kind of based on my European travels now, what I've seen is kind of the defining difference actually between kind of Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I mean, France, of course, famously has the principle of my French pronunciation is terrible, but laïcité. It is famously enshrined that it is an avowedly secular country. Query how that's worked out for them as far as migration and, Jews being killed on the streets are concerned. But, in Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, the Law and Justice Party, the ruling very conservative party in Poland, is very Christian, and it is publicly Christian. They are publicly religious because they understand properly that religion cannot be divorced from a nation's own customs, traditions, principles, and so forth. So anyway, could ramble about this for a little longer, but Ben, why don't you tell us about what's going on to these countries east, of course, pertaining to Russia.
Yeah, well, and let me just say, in the spirit of this last segment, Josh, watch out. You may have a FISA warrant out on you now, having had these travels and spoken positively about what's going on in some of these Eastern European countries. But that's actually relevant in context of this last discussion. And I was sort of almost chuckled at the sort of evil involved in Russia's foreign minister context for this on the eve of a summit with the Biden administration, going out and saying that the Capitol rioters are being persecuted and essentially showing faux concern for effectively what appears to be, in many instances, political prisoners that are being held in pretrial detention, have been held in pretrial detention for months associated with the Capitol riots, many of whom have had no criminal records in the past. And you look at their cases and the treatment they've received, as Julie Kelly, among others, has documented in great detail, where essentially you have these individuals who are not hardened criminals, and it doesn't appear necessarily have ever shown any violence in their past, being held without bail for weeks at a time, oftentimes held in solitary confinement, essentially for large portions of the day, and subjected to all sorts of other conditions that make it seem as if they're in something like a modern gulag in America, associated with the Capitol riots. And of course, Russia views this as a huge propaganda coup for their foreign minister to get up there and say he's concerned about, in effect, American civil rights violations. And I think really Russia is taking this precisely from the playbook of China, as we've talked about at length at that infamous meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor and their Chinese counterparts with the Biden administration. The Chinese counterparts attacked America for its racism and continued human rights violations on the racial front of things. So one element of this is the propaganda coup on the basis, which essentially our government has handed on a silver platter to our adversaries, including the Russians, in terms of what appears to be the deplorable treatment of these individuals arrested in association with the Capitol riots. Another layer of this is any conservative who now dares speak about the mistreatment or alleged mistreatment of those being held in pretrial detention is going to be cast as a Russian agent. So it continues the Russian collusion narrative of things. And then moving beyond that, as I mentioned, this is on the eve of a summit between Russian officials and Biden administration officials as well. And in terms of, you want to talk about collusion and Russian agents, of course, the Biden administration has gone completely soft with respect to Nord Stream 2, a vital energy pipeline into Germany. Historically, Russia has used energy pipelines to its neighbors, including those in Central and Eastern Europe, as essentially a form of geopolitical leverage, where essentially you can shut off the energy flow in the winters and your people can freeze if you don't go along with whatever the favored Russian policy is at a given time. So of course, Nord Stream 2 is something where if you wanted to punish Russia, you would keep them out of Europe and you would do everything you could to impose maximum sanctions with respect to it, and then also provide alternative US energy, for example, both policies that the Trump administration pursued vigorously, and now the Biden administration is going back on. So you see the softness on Russia there. We could also talk about the New START treaty, going back into that with no preconditions, no changes whatsoever, and on with respect to the softness. And then, of course, the anti-energy policies that the Biden administration has taken at home, plus the chaos in the Middle East, which I would argue is in large part a consequence of the perceived weakness of the Biden administration and, in effect, its pro-communist position, all of which means more expensive energy around the world, greater volatility in global markets broadly, and our worst adversaries being the beneficiaries of it, and America doing all sorts of things to shoot itself in the foot. So this is basically a whole ball of horribles here when it comes to both the Russian foreign minister engaging in this propaganda effort, which it appears our government, again, has handed them on a silver platter, and then the broader context of the fact that it makes the administration look very bad in a coming summit where, by all indications already, the Biden administration is going to bend over backwards to Russia. So with all that in mind, I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts with respect to our adversaries generally. Typically, they pick up on the left's propaganda in terms of adopting the view that America is an evil, racist, deplorable place. Here, it's evil and deplorable in context of pursuing what are supposed to be Trumpites, essentially, in the left's imagination. And then the broader context of Russian relations after we had 4 years of supposed collusion and Vladimir Putin love affair, when you see the Biden administration essentially caving at every single turn. With that, I'd open it up to anyone for thoughts on any of those matters.
So I think that last point, I think, is just really galling to me on a number of levels, in particular with Nord Stream 2, because this is the pipeline that, so-called Russian asset Donald Trump spent 4 years making sure sanctions were never lifted, was very aware of the ability of Russia to leverage it, even around Ukraine, right? And to perpetuate its influence in the region. And yet here we have Joe Biden, mere days after the Colonial Pipeline hack, which came from, Eastern Europe / Russia, lifting sanctions on the CEO of the company building Nord Stream 2 and his right-hand man, who happens to be some former East German Stasi, right? And it's a policy so incoherent that Joe Biden is sanctioning the ships that bring materials to the pipeline, but not the company building the pipeline itself. It's just so wildly incoherent. And I have to say that, can you imagine, I know we always say this, but can you imagine if this was Donald Trump? This would be proof positive of the fact that the man was a Russian asset. It was amazing because I was on a podcast last week with David Frum, of all people, and we were debating this question. That's the randomness of my life that I ended up on a podcast debating David Frum. And when I presented this to him, I was like, tell me how Joe Biden is not softer on Russia than Donald Trump. And he was like, well, you just don't understand. This is to fix our relationship with Germany, and it's nothing about Russia. I'm like, no, you don't understand, right? This is actually opening. This is more concessions for concessions. This perpetuation of a failed Obama foreign policy that left us sort of the laughing stock of these petro state empires. So I just think Joe Biden's not getting nearly enough criticism for bending over to Russia on some key strategic terms, particularly Nord Stream 2. And I think it's appalling.
Look, as someone who just interviewed the Prime Minister of Poland, I can assure you that David Frum is wrong. that from our actual allies' perspective, Joe Biden has been orders of magnitude more accommodating has been drastically worse for Russia. Nord Stream 2 is just, it's just kind of the tip of the spear, of course, but it is a very important issue. I mean, in this interview, which will hopefully be public very soon, I think I asked the prime minister like 18 questions. I think his answer on Nord Stream 2 was like his most passionate one. I mean, that is a big deal for these countries over there. Russia, Germany, kind of like the Putin, Merkel, EU alliance. It's just the brazen hypocrisy of Joe Biden kind of signing off on this while blocking Keystone XL. I mean, how do you possibly justify that? I published an op-ed from Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming a couple months ago. I think it was titled like A Tale of Two Pipelines, making that exact point, but look, President Trump, for all of the Steele dossier and all of this salacious nonsense, on actual policy, he was quite tough on Putin. He was quite tough on the Russians. President Trump's 2017 speech in Warsaw, where I just was, where I don't know if he was physically looking east, but he definitely rhetorically was looking to these countries' neighbors to the east, was it was really one of the high watermarks. It was an underappreciated speech, but it was one of the high watermarks of President Trump's presidency. I mean, it was that speech, the UN speech with respect to Kim Jong-un, the Mount Rushmore speech this past 4th of July are probably like my 3 favorite speeches of his, actually. And, on policy, obviously, whether it was New START, missile defense, I mean, kind of over and over again, he was not a friend of Vladimir Putin's. So just the galling hypocrisy of those on the left. It called Trump kind of like a Russia toady. I literally having just been in the region. I mean, like all these countries that, whether or not we have a little, a lot, or somewhere in the middle to learn from them are increasingly like our real allies, right? I mean, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, it's not a close call from their perspective. They are terrified of what Joe Biden is doing to Russia, and they effectively loved everything that Donald Trump did to them. So David Frum is just comically wrong on this one. But it wouldn't be the first time that he is comically wrong on something, alas.
Well, just quickly, it's reflective of the mentality. I mean, Rachel's conflict or tension with David Frum in this particular conversation, I think, is reflective of a broader mentality among the political establishment that because they've been around, they know best, right? Like they know these people, they've haunted these halls, they understand this because they are part of the machine. But that's the disadvantage for them, right? Like they can't get enough distance to have better perspective. As Josh just said, how do you possibly justify this? How do you possibly justify this? The only way to justify this is to be so close to the situation that you can't see the forest for the trees, and to be like, so have this like galaxy brain mindset that like what's right is wrong, what's up is down, because and someone told you that it's actually up. It looks down, but trust me, I know, I've been around, I know that it's up. And I'll just finish by saying, for all of the hay that was made over the course of the Trump administration for his collusion with Russia, which turned out to be completely empty. I mean, I remember back when Mitt Romney was mocked by then President Barack Obama and said, hey, admit the 1980s called and they want their foreign policy back, and was telling Medvedev that he would have more flexibility after the upcoming election. I mean, the fiction about the Republican Party's relationship with Russia and Donald Trump's relationship with Russia was always most egregious because it was the left itself and the Democratic Party itself that was soft on Russia and was bad on Russia. So it's never really made much sense.
Yeah, so just to put a bow on this before we go to parting shots, I think my conclusion or summary, and maybe this encapsulates most all of this episode, is if you wanted to shred apart the culture, undermine our economy, and empower our worst adversaries, what would you do differently than the Biden administration? And I ask that as a rhetorical question, but I actually don't think that there is a compelling response to that. I think it speaks for itself. But with that, I'll turn it over to everyone else for parting shots. Whoever would like to go first, feel free to jump in.
Well, I'm happy to hop in there. Seeing the eagerness to hop in. Look, I could just riff a little bit more about my trip over there, honestly. So look, I here in the U.S. It seems like when we talk about foreign policy, we tend to focus on certain countries. Obviously, China is the elephant of all elephants. It properly eats up like a large share of our attention span, our cumulative attention span as it pertains to foreign policy. Russia, while their nuclear arsenal is quite literally decaying from the Cold War, they still are a nuclear power, probably bordering on nuclear superpowers. Therefore, they necessarily demand a lot of our attention as well. You obviously have the number one state sponsor of jihad and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Middle East, for various reasons, will never kind of get out of the American consciousness. But, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about over the past couple of months, and my recent trip kind of only solidified with me, we need to do a better job of kind of thinking about other regions of the world. Obviously, I'm sure we have, people in the professional DC class who are doing this, but I kind of just mean more of us on kind of the right of center, talking heads, writers, et cetera. I've kind of told my Newsweek opinion team, my deputy editors, over and over again, I tell them, like, I want more Latin American content. I talk about a region of the world that I think, like, the median American conservative does not really pay a whole lot of attention to. I mean, it's kind of like Monroe Doctrine 101. It's right here in our own hemisphere, right? But then kind of bringing it back to Europe and my recent travels there. I mean, even there, from a kind of a U.S. perspective, I'm an Anglophile. I love the UK. I did a college semester there, and Brexit. I mean, there's kind of this special alliance, Reagan, Thatcher, and we're looking. I think a lot of us are looking carefully to see what Boris Johnson is doing as far as kind of reviving the Tories and kind of working class parts of England. But if you look east, right, if you can kind of get past kind of the Brussels, Paris, Berlin hub of kind of Western elite liberalism and progressive values, there really is kind of a lot to kind of look at there. And there was a kind of a forthright assertion of national traditions, a forthright assertion of religious values and customs, and basically a defiance, kind of wagging of the proverbial or literal finger to kind of the EU, bureaucrats in Brussels, the UN bureaucrats in Turtle Bay, and all of the other kind of equivalent of transnationalism and kind of the modern empires. And they're basically saying, we are now a nation state, we are sovereign, and we're not going anywhere. And, I think that there really is kind of a lot to learn there from a right of center American perspective. I really do.
I know we're kind of hurting for final thoughts today, but I think Josh is right. Like, I think so. And I think going back to kind of what Emily said too, that in a lot of these countries, you see, what has perpetuated their fall and then rise, I guess I would say, right? And I think a lot of these factors are now impacting us right now. This, lack of any sort of binding ties, that hold the culture together, but I think also that hold the market together. And I guess this goes back to the brief comment I made about Paul Ryan when I said the culture and the market transact upon each other in really meaningful ways. I was reading some Hayek again recently, and he makes an interesting point where, so much of what Hayek says about the free market rests on the assumption that there's a moral consensus, right? That's what keeps the market in play. That's what infuses it with trust, that allows, the information to flow freely. And when that doesn't exist, you don't even have a free market, on which so much of our DC institutions are want to point to and say, this is what makes us great. This is what makes us a strong democracy. So these two things are very, very important. And when you lose that sense, of the unifying culture, the touchstones that we also, all once agreed upon, then you start to lose something very tangible about our political self-government, but also I think about what keeps us together as a nation. And I think if we lose sight of that, then we are destined to go down some, I think, very dark roads that maybe some other countries have gone before us. So I know that's not necessarily the most optimistic note, but perhaps by paying attention, we can ward off some of the, I think, greater evils.
You heard it here first, tech bros. Rachel reads Hayek.
I read a lot of Hayek. No one gives me credit, but I do.
I think she just made a really profound point, though, Rachel, because this is the notion that so much of what we know and believe to be true and have, gone through the experiment, know that it's true about human behavior and about freedom and justice and equality and fairness, that the American system, I think, really exemplifies. So much of that philosophy does depend on having a moral consensus. And I think we take for granted, actually, that we don't agree on what a man and a woman is anymore. It used to be that we didn't agree with the sort of fringe academics on stuff like that. But we fundamentally don't agree that this is a good country. We fundamentally don't agree what a man and a woman, or what constitutes a man, what constitutes a woman. We fundamentally don't agree on some very, very, very basic facts. And that trickles down into things like not believing in, election results or whatever it is. That does trickle down. But the bottom line is, I think it's very easy for us, because it happens so quickly, to get past the fact that this is a very fundamental thing we do not agree on. Like when you're talking about biological sex, or when you're talking about racial equality, or when you're talking about bigotry or white supremacy, or all these things, go down the line. We fundamentally don't agree on these things anymore. And I think that we underappreciate exactly what a crisis that is, because it's not something we touch every single day. We do, but it's not something we kind of immediately touch every single day, but it's the sort of subterranean, root cause of so much of this. And I don't know, to end on an optimistic note, classical architecture in Hungary. And that is really actually very optimistic, because it means the human spirit is sort of pining for something, and that is translating something greater, something higher and transcendent. And that's translating into the material world. And hopefully that's an optimistic note to end it on. But I have just a hard time understanding how, we can compare ourselves to prior eras, 1968. How did we get through 1968? All of these political assassinations, all of this violence. Well, we did still have shared values, and we don't anymore. But for now, I'll put my faith in classical architecture.
Well, and just to kind of reinforce those comments, it's worth noting that, of course, you can have the greatest constitution and the best laws ever written in the history of mankind, but if you don't have a moral and virtuous people, ultimately it all crumbles. And only a free republic like ours can only be sustained with a people who really have share the values and principles from which the laws and the documents and the customs of our nation derive. So relating to that, I've long held that while we may have won the Cold War in the traditional sense, this is harkening back to the Eastern Europe and Russia conversations, the Cold War for the American mind has really been a hot war for decades, and it never stopped. And sort of creating indecision or dissension, or essentially creating all of these wedges and leveraging them to divide us, is exactly what our worst adversaries always wanted. And it's put us in a place where we consequently are following in the footsteps of tyrannies of the past. And granted, thank God, we still have at least half the country or so that, as I always say, has its head on relatively straight and understands the stakes and the consequences and rejects this alien ideology of leftism, wokeism, whatever you want to call it, that's being foisted upon us. But I do think it is worth noting and acknowledging, especially as we come up on, I guess now the 32nd anniversary of Tiananmen Square, that in these communist, fully leftist, arch leftist empires that have existed throughout time, it is always about dominating in the realm of ideas, because if you dominate in the realm of ideas, you dominate in the material realms and every other realm as well. And that is why, going back to the Paul Ryan conversation, engaging in the war of ideas, which directly impacts culture, is essential, or you lose everything else. And so to that end, I would say, the way to honor the lives lost of those who have been crushed by tyrannies, and then the way to also defend our national interest ultimately, is you have to engage in the war of ideas, because the other side has been engaged in a perpetual war against us, and we ought to summon the courage and the energy to do so ourselves with equal gusto. And by the way, the other side will back down if they actually are met with a rigorous, not only defense, but offense as well. It's always instructive when you see those who do challenge them, and they're taken aback because they can't believe that someone would actually dare to put up a fight. So as always, to try to end on a positive note, hopefully the efforts of those who, as we've talked about, are sort of rebuilding after having been dominated by tyranny, as well as the efforts of those who have stood up against the woke mob, should instill in all of us courage and animate all of us to get as involved and active as we possibly can. So with that, this has been another edition of NatCon Squad. For Josh, Emily, and Rachel, I'm Ben Weingarten. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next time.